Welcome to the Texas Conflict Coach radio program. If you have ever experienced or engaged in destructive or unresolved conflict, then you know it leads to broken relationships, distrust, and damaging results. Our program will help you manage and resolve conflict effectively with strategies, valuable resources, and support. I am your host, Patty Porter. My guest hosts, Dina Zametta and Stephen Kotev, along with our guest experts, will share our experiences, raise your awareness, and give you food for thought. We will share with you problem-solving strategies no matter what your situation is. At work, with neighbors or friends, family, and with partners. Tune in or join in the conversation every Tuesday evening. We continue our series on courageous conversations between parents and their children, even their adult children. Our episode today is Ducking the Boomerang, tips and tactics for adults and adult children to engage effectively. And we have with us Hassan Sorrells. You know, with even more millennials and young people between the ages of 18 and 34 returning home to live with older adults, there are all kinds of issues that arise around expectations, assumptions, and stages of life. And while there's always been a population of younger adults living with their parents, this has become actually more acute since 2008, leading to the term Boomerang Kids. Now, Hassan will share 3 actionable tips that both younger adults and their older adult parents can do to make this situation less conflict-prone. So who is Hassan Sorrells? And let me just spell his name. It's Jessan, Sorrells, Sorrells. So Hassan is the principal conflict engagement consultant at Human Services Consulting and Training based in Endicott, New York. He focuses on delivering solutions in the area of conflict communication and leadership through coaching, workshops, trainings, and seminars for higher education organizations, nonprofits, small businesses, and with individuals. Now, Hassan has an active blog presence through the HSCT, that's the Human Services Consulting and Training, communication blog, as well as an ever-expanding content footprint on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And, in fact, you can connect with him on our live Twitter feed at Sorrells79, Sorrells 79. There on Twitter. We're doing our live Twitter feed tonight using the hashtag TCC Radio. We are also taking live callers tonight, and you can call us at 347-324-3591 and simply select the number 1 key to speak to us, or certainly type with us in our chat room that we currently have opened at blogtalkradio.com/Texas-conflict-coach. Hassan, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me on the show, Patty. I really appreciate it, and I can't wait to get started in on this topic.
Well, we will definitely do that. You know, we've been following each other on Twitter and the social media networks for a while, and that's how we met. And so we have a passion about conflict. And what a topic to talk about this month, about these courageous conversations that parents need to have with their children, or these adult children need to have with their parents. So tell us a little bit. Let's let the listener get to know you a little bit. But what's your background experience with the phenomenon of adult children living at home?
Well, you know, I got to put everything in context, and so thank you for asking me about my background. I had almost a decade before I came upon the work that I'm doing right now in conflict engagement as a conflict engagement practitioner. And my work in higher education really focused around the area of student affairs. And with student affairs, particularly with living on campus with individuals between the ages of 18 and 22, I used to joke that I got to see the end result of everybody's parenting. Sometimes it was, you know, walking out of the residence halls at 8 o'clock on a Friday night and then walking back into the residence halls at 3 o'clock on a Saturday morning. And so I got to see the results of people's positive decisions and of people's maybe not so positive decisions. And I've also seen the phenomenon of what was one time called helicopter parenting, although that term is starting to fall a little bit out of cultural favor. But, you know, the phenomenon of parents who are really super involved in students' lives and really super engaged with students, and couldn't really sort of disengage from them and allow them to have their own college experience. Now, on the one hand, we think that this is okay and this is great when students are in college because they're 18, 19, 20, 21. But then that magical thing happens, and they graduate college and they have the degree, and they get out of college, they graduate, they throw the cap up in the air, and it's all wonderful and great, and there's flowers and kisses and all that kind of stuff. And then the job search doesn't go as well as they thought it was going to go, or they get a position that doesn't fit with their degree, or maybe there's a lot of student loan debt there, and there's a lot of other economic factors that go into those decisions and how things fall out. And as a result of that, they move back home with mom and dad. And now mom and dad, who were really actively involved, and we're thinking, hey, finally, this person that I got through high school and I got through college is now 22, 23, and they'll go out on their own and they'll have a degree. We did what we were supposed to do, and now they're back.
And now they're back.
And now they're back. And so, a lot of parents really feel stressed by those types of situations, because now you have an adult living in your house, sometimes a third adult, or even in some cases a fourth adult living in your house, who, and I say you're only in the sense of it's a house that maybe you're paying the mortgage on, or an apartment you're paying the rent on, and you have been for a while, and this person is now back in the house, and the interactions between parents and children, particularly as children become adults, have always been fraught with transitional issues. But typically those issues are worked through by the child moving out of the house and becoming a fully formed adult on their own. But then when they're not able to do that and they have to come back into the house, that can sometimes create tensions, problems, and even sometimes conflicts.
So let's get clarity on some definitions here. And one of the things I had not heard of. Now we've all probably experienced, known of friends, known of other family members of the child goes back home, and we're not talking like a teenager child. We're talking adult children that, like you said, could be in their early 20s, they could be in their 30s, they could be in their 40s, and so the term you're using is Boomerang Kid. Say more about that terminology, Boomerang Kid, where'd that come from, and actually who fits into that category. So give some clarity around that.
Sure. Well, when we talk about Boomerang Kids, or quote-unquote the Boomerang generation, typically, particularly in the context of this conversation, we're talking about individuals between the ages of 18 to 34. Now, those individuals, or that generation, is typically, like I said, defined as the current generation of young adults that's returning to live at home with older parents. And according to the Fortune magazine article that we referenced on the page for our show today, the share of younger adults living at home has actually increased from 24% to 26% over the last 5 years. And the number of young adults living independently, and by independently we mean, living outside of the house, paying their bills, that kind of stuff, has actually decreased 2 percentage points from 69% to 67%. Now, typically, the big part of the big chunk of this definition that you have to consider is with those young people between the ages of 18 to 34 returning home, it's typically for financial reasons, and financial reasons can be fairly rough. And the economy, depending upon which area of the country you're in, and depending upon which industry you may happen to be in, or where you've gotten your education, may not necessarily have recovered as much as the rest of the economy since 2008. And so there are some driving factors and driving forces that push adult children to move back home.
Okay, and we're going to talk about that. So I like the metaphor, boomerang. You throw the boomerang and it comes back to you. Maybe you catch it. Maybe you get hit up in the head, causing those stressors. And that effect. And I'm glad that you defined again the age range, the typical age range, 18 to 34. So it's not just kids who might be coming out of their bachelor's degree. Could be those that just went straight to master's and then came home after the master's degree and things of that nature. So one of the factors that you just mentioned, a really big factor, is this financial reason that they move. What can you say more about the economic factors, about what drives them, or any other factors that might be driving them back home?
Absolutely. Well, we can tie this to two things that we see happening in the overall larger economy, and I'm going to name two things here that have gotten a lot of media play, but also really reveal some underlying stressors in the economy that contribute to the fact of the boomerang generation. The first thing is that I'm going to mention is Airbnb and Uber. The rise of the sharing economy. And the reason that there is the rise of the sharing economy is because the amount of money that used to be in the economy due to market capitalization and market forces, stock buybacks, things like that, and the level of real wages has actually decreased tremendously for the middle class since 2008. And so with that, you have people who actually had assets beforehand who now have the asset but don't really have any way to make money off of it, and so they'd rather share that asset. And when you're talking about a car, in the case of Uber, or you're talking about an apartment or a living space in the case of Airbnb, that's a nice way to make a little extra money, but also it's a nice way to sort of have that asset be shared among a younger population. And so your younger population is very, very comfortable sharing assets, very, very comfortable with not owning, very comfortable with renting instead of owning. And the fact of the matter is that the older generation that they are boomeranging back into are the baby boomers, who statistically speaking, were not as impacted by the negative financial consequences of 2008 as maybe Generation X was, or even the Millennials who we're currently speaking about. So economic factors are a huge driver there, particularly around the idea of sharing and living in a collaborative economy. And then the second one is, and I'm not going to be political here, but I am going to say there's one political candidate running for president right now who's actually spoken about this out loud, and that would be Bernie Sanders, and that would be the student loan debt issue that we have in this country. We have about, I think the last statistic that I saw was a $1.5 trillion student loan debt in this country. The majority of that being carried by millennials, Gen Xers, and a few baby boomers, but not too many. The fact of the matter is that student loan debt is crippling the millennial generation. And when you graduate from a four-year institution, you mentioned a master's degree, and I'm glad you mentioned that. But if you graduate from a four-year institution with a degree that's not necessarily hireable, you still got to start paying back that debt 6 months after you get out of school. And if the only jobs you can get or the only employment that you may be able to get are in areas that have not recovered economically, you still have that $300 to $400 a month payment, depending upon what your debt package was. You still have that payment hanging over your head. And so student loan debt is a huge driver for this. And like I said, Bernie Sanders is the only candidate that's really talking about this in sort of a policy way right now. And you can't discharge student loans through bankruptcy or any of those other financial means. So you've got a generation that is very comfortable with not having assets and also has this overwhelming debt hanging over their heads. And so they're saying, hey, why don't we move back home with mom and dad? Why don't we live there? And then 6 months turns into a year turns into 2 years, and then the parent is saying, when are you going to go? And what is that going to look like?
So now, so we're going to talk about some of those challenges shortly here. So for those of you who have joined us live in the studio, in the chat room, or the Twitter feed, thank you for doing that. You are listening to the Texas Conflict Coach Blog Talk Radio program, and we invite you to follow us on Blog Talk Radio, the Texas Conflict Coach. And I'm speaking with Hassan Sorrells about Boomerang Kids and some of the challenges, not only for them but for the parents in these conversations and expectations that when they move back home, how do we deal with some of these really unique, interesting challenges and issues? And so we imagine they're going back home because of this financial debt, the student loan debt that is, and a number of financial reasons that's happening in terms of them being able to stand on their own and get whatever professional careers going for them. So there's a number of economic factors that are involved here. So now they're at home. Mom and dad, come on back. With their expectation of, we'll help you for the next X months or a year, but not certainly for years. So what are the challenges and dynamics between parents and their adult children when they are returned home? So what is some of the friction that's
Right. And one thing I want to make clear up front is millennials are the second largest generation, or actually the first largest generation. 90 million millennials. They're a significantly larger chunk of the population than baby boomers were. And so just because of the scale of the numbers, the problem seems bigger. But let me be clear, children have always sort of used parents as a way to sort of go back home and sort of get their feet and then go back out into the world. That's always happened. But it's become more of an acute thing because of the student loan debt, because of the sharing and collaborative economy and the comfort with that, and because of the job situation post-2008. So you talk about the frictions. So the big friction, and let's be clear about this, the big friction is our conceptions of adulthood. What does adulthood mean, particularly in America? And that's very much wrapped up inside of our ideas around Protestant work ethic and around the messages that we give our children from the time that they are children around autonomy and freedom and what that means, and the messages that they get from culture around that, even from car commercials. A car isn't just a car, it's freedom. Well, adulthood isn't just adulthood, it's freedom. But then you're coming back home, so what does freedom look like? And then we have the issue of the transition from adolescence to adulthood. And the transition from adolescence to adulthood, particularly if in your individual household you had a really rough adolescence with your teenage child. Sometimes the years between 13 and 18 can be glorious and wonderful and a time of great knowledge and learning and just change. And then other times they can be not so great. And so if there have been mental health issues, if there's been issues with sexual orientation or sexual identity, racial identity, if there have been changes with the parents' economic situation, if they've moved from one class level to another, either down or up, those can create frictions that adult children are working through even as they're returning back into the nest. Then there's frictions around autonomy and maturity. What does maturity mean? What does autonomy mean? If you're going to college and you're going to a school, just as an example, you're going to school where there was a heavy partying atmosphere, and maybe you did your fair share of that as an adult child, and then you came back home, you may still have some of those behaviors left over from college, and it takes a while to transition out of those behaviors. So what is the pressure on a parent when they see their child going out and partying every night and then coming back and sleeping all day on the couch? Like, what does that look like? For the adult child, it could just be a transfer of behavior from one environment to another without really knowing sort of how that behavior is impacting a different context and a different environment. And then finally, and I believe this is a truly American phenomenon. Other countries do it with the multi-generational family, do it way better, and other cultures do it way better than we do. But there's also there's shame and societal weight around expectations. And when I was researching, talking about this topic, I really thought of The Graduate back in the 1960s with Dustin Hoffman, where his father asks him, what are you going to be doing? And he's floating in the pool. And I'm a film guy, too. That's one of my things. So he's floating in the pool, and he says, I'm just really sort of enjoying myself floating in the pool here. and in that inside of that one scene, Dustin Hoffman really sort of summed up, and then I can't remember the name of the actor who played the father, but they sort of summed up that whole shame and societal weight and expectations, which really tie back into notions of adulthood and freedom and independence and what that actually looks like in America. So that creates some unstated frictions. And then, of course, there's the personal stuff. That's the larger 50,000-foot stuff. But then there's the personal stuff. If there was trauma in the family, again, difficult transitions during the teenage years, divorce, sexual orientation issues, those kinds of things can be underlying issues that can make it really, really difficult for an adult child to move back home of either gender. That's a non-gendered friction that can exist there.
So lots of challenges, lots of dynamics, and of course the kind of trusting relationship that the parents have with their returning child in terms of that. And, I think most of us have experienced in life, whether we've moved back home or not, that the parents often will continue to see us as their children and oftentimes will, continue those behavioral expectations as children, and we as children, even though we're adults, continue to look at our parents as our parents in regards to when does that transition take place. And of course, when you're living
Right.
back at home, it makes it harder to make that transition into adulthood in your relationship and expectations as a child to a parent, but as an adult child to a parent. So a number of frictions that are taking place. And I guess, in talking about, part of this is, okay, what are these courageous conversations that we need to be having? We know we're going to probably have friction for all the number of reasons that you mentioned here, especially around that autonomy. We got a taste of freedom. We get into college dorms or apartments with
Right.
other roommates, and we got this taste of freedom to stay up as long as we want and to party and do all those things, and now we're going home back to our parents who have a certain set of expectations and house rules, and this is their home, and things of that, all those expectations that come back. So what does it mean to have a courageous conversation, and what are we actually talking about? What are we talking about in these conversations? And so that's a pretty broad question, and I would assume that is this a conversation, in this conversation today, is this a conversation that the parent needs to be initiating with their adult child? Is this, because we might be having adult children who are like, man, this is an issue. I've gone back home and my mom and dad have put the foot down, and, it's like, the thumb is on me, and I'm feeling like I'm smothering here, and yet I need to be back home. So it could be that it's initiated from either the adult child or the parent. But so what are these conversations that parents and their adult children need to be having?
That's a great question. I love it how we're talking about courageous conversations. I want to reference the book Crucial Conversations: Tools for Talking When Stakes Are High by Carrie Patterson, Joseph Greeney, Ron McMillan, and Al Switzler. Folks can get it on Amazon if they just search for Crucial Conversations. But they define crucial conversations as interactions that happen to everyone. They're day-to-day conversations that affect your life, where opinions vary, where stakes are high, and where emotions run strong, sometimes really strong. And the fact of the matter is that crucial conversations are about tough issues, and issues of identity, issues of expectations, issues of freedom and autonomy are really tough issues. And if there was never the foundation to have those kinds of conversations that was set in childhood or even in adolescence, it's going to be even more difficult to have those conversations and initiate those conversations as an adult. But part of being a courageous adult, part of engaging in maturity, is taking on having those conversations. So the first big conversation that I would recommend having if I were talking to an adult child who was listening to me, or even the parent of an adult child, and either one could initiate this conversation, although it's going to be through different frames at either end. But the first conversation is going to be the expectations conversation. So what are your expectations for me around contributing to the household? What are your expectations for me around coming in and going out? Is there a curfew? Is there not a curfew? Do you want me walking in at 3 o'clock in the morning or not? What are some expectations around relationships? Do I have a significant other? I've either the same sex or the opposite sex. Do you care? What does that look like? Am I engaged to this person? Am I marrying this person? Are we just sort of hanging out and not really doing anything? Another dating app is Tinder, and the rise of the hookup culture, which was explored in a Vanity Fair article recently. Do you want me bringing in a hookup, when I'm going out and coming in? Those are the kinds of, I know, and I can already hear parents on the other end of this call or on the other end of the show listening going, oh, my God, I can't have that conversation. Yes, you have to sort of say it. You have to say it out loud to make it real, because if not, you're going to have something, you're going to be walking down to breakfast in the morning and somebody may be sitting there that you don't know, and how
Surprise!
are you going to respond in that? Surprise! How are you going to respond in that situation? So the expectations conversation really has to be focused on the situation, and it's really difficult, but drain it of as much as possible of emotional content, drain the emotional pool on that, and that may be very, very tough. But the expectations conversation is the first one. The second conversation that's difficult is setting boundaries and household rules and what those are and respecting those. And for the adult children, I would say, listen, Just as there were rules when you lived in a residence hall that were set by that residence hall and were reinforced by your resident assistant and were reinforced by folks like myself who used to be residence directors, and if you broke the rules, sometimes security would show up and sometimes there would be some serious consequences. There are some household rules here that your parents may have set, and they may have changed, and you got to give your parents the space to allow those rules to change. And then for parents, I would say you got to give space for your child to be an adult, and know that this person isn't 18 years old anymore; they're 23. Let's sort of move let's move the needle a little bit. So setting boundaries and respecting house rules is a big one.
And I'm glad I just wanted to say one thing about that. I'm glad you addressed the parent too, because it cannot be the same rules that they were when they were 15, like you said. Move the needle a little bit. So I'm glad that you brought that element. It's almost like I don't know if it's a negotiation around ground rules, but it's about, approach it from the angle that they are a 23-year-old, not a 15, 16, 17-year-old. So
Exactly. And then the last two very quickly, special relationships or intimate relationships. We covered that. Girlfriend, boyfriend. What do we look like? What does that look like? Do I want somebody staying over overnight or not? I use my life as an example. I never moved back home I haven't moved back home with my mother, but my older sister has, and so she's in her 40s. And one of the conversations she had with my mother, who's in her 60s, is, I'm divorced, but I'm a 40-some-odd-year-old woman. Like, I'm going to have a relationship, and this is what it's going to look like. And so let's talk about how that's going to look like, and let's talk about about navigating that. Let's have a negotiation conversation, as you said, and having it in an adult-to-adult way. And then the last piece is, and you really reiterated this as well, it's about having an adult-to-adult conversation versus a parent-to-child conversation. And this is where the emotional content really comes in, because all that stuff from the past now comes dredged up and bobs to the surface. And I really hold the parent in this conversation a little more responsible than I hold the adult child. Although in reality they both have equal responsibility. But I would say the parent has the responsibility to say, say right off the bat, you're not 18 anymore, so we're not going to have this conversation from that perspective. Instead, we're going to have this conversation from the perspective of, you're 23, and I'm X, however old it is I am. I'm 53. Let's talk like two adults. The only difference between the two of us is the level of experience that we've had and the timeline along which we have had those experiences. Let's sort of have that conversation in that kind of way. So an adult-to-adult way. No relitigation of the past. Respect and, of course, honor, particularly honor if both parties fail. And that's an important part. That's an important part of having those conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think setting the intention for either, when you're, parents out there listening, really setting that intention that I'm going to have a different kind of conversation as an adult to my adult child, and really being thoughtful about that. So as you're planning your conversation in your head, or you're thinking through these various conversations that need to be had, the expectations conversation, the ground rules, the house rules conversation, the relationships conversation, those need to be had. And I would imagine, when do they have this? What's the best time for them to do that? Once the child's already moved back in, or are you thinking this is before they move back in?
I'm thinking, and this is my best practice. Again, I believe in getting out in front of conflict and engaging it versus avoiding, accommodating, or behaving either passive aggressively or aggressive aggressively in the space of a conflict when it actually arises. So having the conversation early, early and often, and really reinforcing what's said in the conversation through actual lived behavior, because just like they did when they were a child, now they're going to be looking at you, and they're going to know hypocrisy if they're the child in the adult child in that relationship. They're going to know hypocrisy, and they're going to pick it up in a heartbeat. So it's about living that through, having that lived example, and like I said, early, and often. That's when you should have those conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing, and I know it's probably understood, but one of those focused conversations, as you were saying, focused on the situation, you definitely have to have is the money conversation, right? Meaning, okay, Are we contributing to rent? Are we contributing to food? If they're not working, what does that mean? So that money conversation, I think, becomes really important part of that expectations conversation, and the whole conversation around the use of recreational drugs, smoking, things like that they might have explored in college and continue to do. Absolutely, those are, two hot areas I could see really be explosive. So definitely having those conversations as well. Really, really good piece of that. Anything that I didn't ask you that you wished I would have asked you in terms of this conversation today? Because we could go on forever on this conversation, but something that you wish I would have asked you that you'd like to say now.
Well, I would one area, and this is an area that many peace builders and negotiators in other spaces may sometimes avoid. It's sort of the third rail topic, and the third rail topic really is religion. And sometimes people go to college, and either they were religious and then they fall out of that. Sometimes people go to college and they become more confirmed in their beliefs, whatever those may happen to be, rather than less. And the parent changes, or the child goes away to college, and the parent is then seen as being more rigid. The fact of the matter is, religion, just like sexual relations or sexual relationships and money, like you were saying, religion, sex, and money, those are all third rail topics. Even in polite society and even in polite conversation between two non-related adults. Well, when you're talking about two related adults, those are even more third rail conversations. And so I think talking honestly about what that means and what that looks like, do you need your adult child to go to church with you or whatever structure it is that you go to? Do you need them to do that in order to honor your belief system, or are you comfortable letting them go and develop their own belief system? Some people are very, very hesitant. Many people are very, very hesitant to bring this up. But that would be one area that I would also talk about and have an open, honest conversation. Again, as much of the emotional content, and it's very difficult around religion, but to sort of drain that as much as possible and realize that you're talking from one adult to another, and so it has to be with respect and honor.
No, absolutely. I had, let's just say I know some people whose teenage daughter came home from college and said, I grew up Catholic, but now today I'm agnostic or atheist. And so, that was a big revelation for them, So it was like, okay, so what does this really mean? They're testing out their identity. And I'm glad you brought that up, because next week we actually have a special guest who is focused just on that topic. What happens if your child starts to test their religious faith, their beliefs that are different from what they were growing up, and how do we have those conversations? So we're going to actually have a special episode just on that topic next week. So I hope listeners, you come back and listen to that particular episode with Janet Bonin. Let's go, as we start to close down, this has been a great conversation, Hassan. I really appreciate that. We always leave with our listeners getting an assignment for the week or a call to action. What do you have for them?
Well, first off, thank you again for having me on the show, Patty. I really do appreciate it. I love what you're doing with the Texas Conflict coaching show here. I love that you're putting out this resource. This is a courageous resource that you're putting out there for your listeners, and I want to thank the listeners as well for taking the time out of their day, and hopefully everything that I've said here today has been a value add for them. As far as an assignment for the week. Oh, yeah, you're welcome. As far as an assignment for the week and a call to action, I believe calls to action and assignments should be things that you can go out and do right now. So anybody who's listening, whether you're a parent of an adult child or you're the adult child who is anticipating moving back in because maybe things aren't working out financially the way that you thought they would, sit down with a piece of paper, sit down with a notepad, and make a plan. Plan out that conversation. What is the expectations conversation? What areas and topics do I want to cover, and really write those down? How am I going to address the other party with respect, and what words am I going to use that are going to be respectful words versus words that I know will trigger them? And then how am I going to and the last question that you would write on that notepad is, how am I going to preserve the relationship? Relationships are the most valuable things that we have in this world, and yes, conflict breeds change, and change is how relationships grow and develop and mature. but change handled badly and conflict handled badly can sometimes wreck relationships. And so we're about preserving relationships and making them endure. And again, I go back to that word honor. So, make a list, make a plan, expectations, respect, and how are we going to preserve those relationships.
Great. That is very action-oriented to do right away, and that's what our intention is. So thank you for giving them a guide on how they can get started on preparing for that conversation. Where can folks find you?
Absolutely. So folks can always find me on the HS Consulting and Training website. I'm at www.hsconsultingandtraining, that's all one word, .com. If you type in the /blog, you can check out all my blog articles. I publish a blog post every single day. Some days it's 100 words. Some days it's 1,000 words. Just depends. I go as long as I need to go. But I'm blogging every day, and I blog in the space where conflict engagement meets real life, in the areas of marketing, entrepreneurship, business, but also interpersonal conflict communication. They can also check out my podcast, again, on the HS Consulting and Training website at www.hsconsultingandtraining.com /earbudu. You can follow me on Twitter at earbudu. You can also check me out on Instagram. I post some stuff when I go around for the show. And, of course, you can follow me on Twitter at Sorrells79 or check me out on LinkedIn, Hasan Sorrells. Just go to LinkedIn and type in Hasan Sorrells, JESAN SORRELLS.
That's awesome. Well, you obviously have a great footprint out there in the social media world and in the web world, so you're very easy to find. And, again, thank you so much for being a part of our program, educating our listening audience from around the world about a very interesting topic and having these courageous conversations. And so, Hasan, what final message do you want to leave with our listeners tonight?
Absolutely. Well, the final message that I want to leave with you is that for both adult children and the parents of adult children, I want you to remember, and it sounds trite, but it's really not, this is not forever, and this too shall pass. It's how we get through to the next step that matters. So it's not forever, this too shall pass, and how we get through this matters a lot more than what we are getting through.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Hasan, and thank you, everyone, for joining us in the chat room, studio, and the Twitter feed. Good night.
Thank you, Patty. Good night.
Thank you for listening to the Texas Conflict Coach. We hope you enjoyed the program. You can find all of our podcasts archived to listen at your convenience at texasconflictcoach.com or download the podcast at iTunes or Stitcher Radio. You can also become a Facebook fan of Conflict Connection or Twitter me at TX Conflict Coach.